Let's just pick up the conversation where we just were with some new guests with different perspectives. Todd Swanstrom from University of Missouri St. Louis is back on the program, as is Patricia Bynes, the Democratic committee woman who really a lot of people got to know on Twitter and on everything from Channel 5 to CNN starting back in August. You were very active in Ferguson. And Justin Hansford, who we've also seen very active in your role as a professor in the St. Louis University Law School and in other ways. So if we were going to schedule and celebrate STL250 now, how might it be different, or do you think it was representative of our current history as we know it before now?
I think we'd have to make a few changes and maybe tackle some subjects that maybe they weren't thought about or wanted to include before, but we can't ignore anymore. Just to make sure that we give a really good representation of the history and the future that's coming for St. Louis and the St. Louis region.
Did it? I mean, some people might say that, boy, we were doing great, and then Ferguson happened. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the reasons that Ferguson is so important, because many thought that we were doing great, and Ferguson sort of was a surprise. But so for members of the African American community in particular who have lived under this cloud of predatory policing and racial profiling for many decades, it was a turning point where they were able to have their narrative become part of the broader narrative. And I think that was a real change in St. Louis history. We're going to see how it changes things going forward.
Are people comfortable with that change in narrative?
Well, I think, you said things were going great. Well, in some ways, we should be proud of what happened, because we really crystallized an issue that the entire country is talking about now. In fact, all over the world. It's not this kind of abuse of policing, this kind of lack of accountability, exists in many other places. It's immigrants, it's, all sorts of different manifestations. So, usually St. Louis is like, somebody once said, we're so average, it's weird, But in this case, we're on the cutting edge. I mean, we really got out front of something and forced people all over the country to address an issue that they hadn't really thought about.
Right.
But it's not hard to find some folks who are worried that our image is tarnished. It's not hard to find, and I'm talking to people who have, you might consider, I don't know, for lack of a better term, open minds and big hearts, who are worried that if we don't get this right, that we're going to be headed in the wrong direction. That this was a fragile city to begin with that was doing its best to promote its startups.
Well, I was going to say, I had a chance to go to the United Nations with Mike Brown's parents, and it's true that even in Geneva, Switzerland, they're talking about this. And so the region is potentially going to face long-term repercussions for its image unless it turns the corner. And I think one thing that really separates this incident from past incidents of unrest is we've had a number of youth leaders step up. People have been active in the community trying to make a change. People are now going to the halls of power. Politicians are stepping up and trying to make change, so we're not going to just leave it there at what happened to Mike Brown. We're trying to turn the corner and turn this into a story with a happy ending, so to speak.
I think it's important to realize that when people said things were going great, they weren't. There are many people now who are aware of what's going on, and they're being faced to force these issues, because these aren't new issues in the Black community. These are just conversations that we've continued to have that have not been addressed. So if we're worried about an image, let's deal with reality, and the image will take care of itself.
Well, I think what's interesting about this is people don't make a differentiation in the rest of the country and the rest of the world between Ferguson and St. Louis. What happened in Ferguson applies to St. Louis. And we all know Ferguson is one small community of 21,000 and a metropolitan area of 2.8 million, but people don't make that distinction. So what we should have learned from this is that every community matters to the region. And we as a region, if the parts aren't happy, the whole is not going to be happy.
And is this, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll leave it to you guys to opine. I mean, this could have easily been called name your other suburban town or other city. Ferguson itself may not have stood out for any other reason above any other. Fair?
Easily.
Yeah, in fact, in some ways, Ferguson, is a larger than some communities, probably has made some progress in certain areas that other communities have not made. So it's really somewhat arbitrary that Ferguson is where this erupted, but it represents a whole series of communities in St. Louis and all over the country again.
Right.
So it's one, you can see the universe in a grain of sand. You know, you can see a lot of issues in one community, and it represents a lot of truths about what's going on.
So is it too soon? You talk about young leaders are stepping up. How can you make some predictions on the history books here for us? Is it too soon to see where our story is going? How will we celebrate 300 in St. Louis? What will the story look like then?
Well, I think we have a very exciting opportunity in St. Louis County, but specifically Ferguson, for the April 7th election. There are 3 council seats that are coming up, so we're going to have a chance to see if all the conversation about voting and getting engaged and staying engaged is able to stick, not just in Ferguson, but just like Ferguson is representative of all these other communities, if they're stepping up to the plate too to make it happen, we've got to get involved at the policy level with elections and make sure good people are getting in office and keep them accountable to what they say they're going to do.
Right, I agree. I think we have to make sure that we don't allow this to be a moment, but we turn it into a movement. And the way that you do that is you find the next step and the next step, and you try to create a pathway towards real, sustainable, structural change. And so I think the young leaders are stepping up. They're still engaged. We're going on 6 months after the killing of Mike Brown. And I think, 6 years from now, I think it's really something to be excited about, to wonder how these youth leaders who are 20, 21, 22 years old, who are being invested in from people around the country who have had national media exposure, how will they represent St. Louis? How will they change St. Louis 6 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? I think it's a really exciting time to think about.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people that I would guess didn't imagine themselves in these kinds of roles. Did you imagine yourself in the role you found yourself in? Obviously, you were involved in politics to some degree, but
Right.
I mean, do you have the energy to sustain your involvement?
Not only do I have the energy, I have the responsibility to do so. I don't think that you can see something like this happen and begin to walk away. So while we might not know whose fault it is, it doesn't matter. We all have responsibility to help change this.
Well, I think Justin put his finger on, if you talk about 50 years from now, what will be different. I think we need structural change. You use the word structure. I think we need institutional change, which is to say the communities in North County have to start collaborating across these small municipalities. We also probably need new institutions. We need foundations and nonprofits that learn how to operate in this suburban environment, which is very different than the city environment. So if we don't change structurally and institutionally, I think it'll be, frankly, it could be kind of a burnout. The energy, it's very difficult when you have institutions that don't have the capacity and the reach and the to really address the problem. So it's going to have to be structural change.
Do we need some sort of wholesale change? I'm just thinking about the way, society, you tell me how societies are built, but they, sometimes on a little patchwork basis, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, it'd be great if our power lines were underground instead of tangled over the streets.
Right.
There was some tangled stuff, some would argue, in our duplication of services and other things of that nature.
Right.
Do we need someone with a grand plan and a grand vision for how life can be better for everyone?
Yeah, I don't think there'll be one individual who will have a grand plan from the mountaintop, so to speak. I think that there have been some initial positive steps, civilian review boards, amendment to the state's Racial Profiling Act, body cams. Some people are for that. I'm personally against it, but it's something that people are considering. Those are baby steps, but I think the big change is going to be, are we going to look at our communities of color, our black and brown communities, as citizens, no longer as targets? And so the way to do that is to take a human rights perspective on how we look at members of our region, and we're going to have a commitment towards being more inclusive for everyone. So it is going to take a huge transition, a huge change of policing culture, political culture, civic engagement, and I think if we do all those things, we'll be just fine.
You mentioned body cameras, and you're not for them. I mean, if folks can't even agree on body cameras, there are a lot of different elements to what we've been talking about for the past 6 months. Can you do that without some sort of centralized leadership of some kind? there's a lot of different issues with a lot of different leaders.
Democracy is messy, Casey.
Right.
It's not neat.
right.
It's not. There's not going to be a top-down solution, and we're not going to know how this scenario plays out. But throughout American history, I mean, I have faith in American democracy. It's going to be messy. It's going to be conflictual, and it's going to be unpleasant.
And do we
at
not
times.
know that because we haven't experienced that in our lifetimes necessarily? Any
No,
messiness?
think about the 60s and 70s. A lot happened, and I think it brought issues to the fore, and we addressed things. We made a 90-degree turn in the 60s with the victories of the civil rights movement. I think we now are in a situation where we have a new set of issues that it's race and economics intertwined, which makes it in some ways more difficult. But we shouldn't forget that we've made major history here, and you can register to vote, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
literally, 50 years ago, a large part of the black population of the United States was disenfranchised forcefully, from voting.
Is it marginalized people regardless? You said race and economics. Is it marginalized that we're talking about here, and that might cover multiple people?
I think there are a lot of people who do not participate in the political process. When you look at the number of people who come out to vote in municipal elections across the country, it's not just a low turnout in Ferguson or in St. Louis County. Most people traditionally do not vote other than in November elections. That is a mindset that has to change regardless of what their income level is. So that's something internal in our country that we need to change and let people know. I've been telling people, run down the halls of City Hall. That's where we need to start, is at the ground level at City Hall. Then we can work ourselves up to DC.
Yeah, and I think the question of economic justice is central to this whole entire conversation. We have a huge wealth gap and a huge amount of inequality in our society. I think nationally we have an average African American household with about $5,000 in wealth,
Right.
average white household with nearly $100,000 in wealth.
Yep.
And so these are huge gaps. And so we see, the phrase Black Lives Matters is important because those huge gaps in wealth translate into huge gaps in political access, huge gaps in social capital, huge gaps in quality of life. And then one of the way it manifests is in policing, and which communities can be over-policed, which communities can be targeted for predatory policing and ticketing so that you can fill your municipal coffers. All of these different sites of inequality combine to create just a horrible situation for black and brown communities and marginalized communities. So there's a lot of work to do.
So it's like, back in the civil rights period, people demonstrated in order to be able to sit on the bus, to sit anywhere they wanted on the bus. Well, what if you can sit on the bus anywhere, but there's no bus that goes by your house? Or what if the bus that goes by your house, it's an hour and a half to the first job you can get? Well,
Right.
then you have the right, but it doesn't really mean much unless it's given real content by having good jobs, good schools, and I think a very important issue in St. Louis is the disparity in household wealth that Justin was talking about. Literally, African Americans have, in the United States, broadly speaking, 5% of white household wealth. And that has to do with this history of only being able to buy in certain neighborhoods in St. Louis. And you can study that.
A lot of that wealth is in your home.
And you
Yes.
could not buy in good neighborhoods. Imagine if you bought a home in, I don't know, Webster Groves or Kirkwood, back in the 50s and 60s, what would it be worth today? In some North county areas, that home hasn't appreciated 1/4 of that amount, right? So you just never got on the bus, right, to really get that household wealth. And all the research shows now that assets are as important as income. If you don't have assets, you can't weather crises. You end up liquidating everything in order to survive. A foreclosure can ruin a family. A health crisis can ruin your family if you don't have assets to fall back on to succeed in American society. It's just a reality.
Let's take a break, and we'll talk a little bit more about St. Louis assets and what we can and what our story is going forward, because that's something you've talked about on the show before, long before Ferguson as well. But we want to hear what you're saying. Hashtag stay tuned, STL.